So now we're going to talk about the second half of our presentation, and you can listen to this at your leisure before you take your pajama quiz. And so one of the things that we talked about in our overview was how important the media is to shaping culture, to shaping our ideas, to even changing the culture. And so a lot of people debate what the role is in media in our everyday lives, right? So, and this has always been the case. This is not anything new. It happened before you were born. It happened even in the time of TV. You can imagine the debates that occurred early on when TV was new, when radio was new, when those things just so rapidly changed the culture too. So even in ancient Greeks, before you had the printing press, they argued about whether plays corrupted the youth. And then early in the 20th century, Americans were afraid that low culture would undermine American values. And so there is low culture and high culture, right? So low culture might be those types of entertainments, maybe B movies or comic strips, or those things that are not really what you would think. If I said high culture, you'd think, operas, Shakespearean plays, those kinds of things. And so people are afraid that, TV shows and sitcoms, when they started to develop, would undermine American values. And so the media do play a controversial role in modern society. And so people have grappled with the merits of those things for centuries, right? And so how much does media shape society, and how much does mass media simply respond to the existing values and behaviors that we already have? And so we did talk about so many of the media industries now are owned by companies, and so that power is concentrated into the hands of a few, right? So in 2017, 3 years ago, American media industries earned more than $700 billion. And so the media's influence has grown, right? But the number of people who control and own the media has gotten smaller, right? And so you can definitely tell over the past 30 years would be the time of the introduction to the personal computer and the internet in that time period. And so it has just exponentially grown too. And so some people are concerned about that concentration of power. And so to monitor the quality of the culture, to monitor this, you really do need to become media literate. And so that's what we're going to do and spend our time this semester doing. And so there are different approaches to understanding the impact of media on our lives. One way is to explore the cultural context in which the media operate. So culture is defined as the symbols of expression that individuals, groups, societies use to make sense of daily life and to articulate their values. There are different ways to look at the cultural approach. So let's briefly look at one, which is called the linear model, right? So the linear model, a lot of scholars now see as outdated. At the time, they viewed mass comm as a linear process where senders transmit messages through gatekeepers. Those are the media, right? So the television, the radio, the newspapers, these are all gatekeepers. And so the editors decide whether they're going to run that story or not. And the producers decide whether they're going to air that television story or not. Those are the gatekeepers. And we'll talk more about gatekeepers later because they are still a really important part of the media process. So the sender sends a message. The gatekeeper decides, do we send this message or not? Is this an important message to the receivers, right? And so The senders often have little control over how that message gets out, or even if it does get out at all, right? The message doesn't always get to the intended receiver, and then the receiver doesn't always interpret the message clearly. So there's some problems in the linear model. You can see, though, that there's some basis of truth in it. It does make sense, and you can actually watch that occur today, right? And so, but now we have so many channels through which the media operate, right? And so let's look at the cultural model, right? So the cultural model is when individuals begin to bring different meanings to the messages. And so you can see how this is true with social media, and how individual, it's a community experience, but also we all as individuals have an opportunity to be a part of that. So we actually don't always have the gatekeeper function the way it used to be, because now it's almost like all those messages get thrown out, and we are our own gatekeepers in many ways, right? And so the individuals, the messages, a lot determines that, you know, our gender, our age, our ethnicity, our cultural viewpoints, all that's part of culture, right? What part of the country we live in, if we live in America, and again, that's different if we lived in another country. That cultural model is a lot different from what we experience every day. Or if you're from the South, that cultural model might be different from a person who lives in the North. So what this does, it allows the audiences to have a lot more influence. We don't have to wait for the gatekeeper to decide. We can decide, do we like this message? Do we believe this message? Do we want to reshape the message? Do we reject the message? So we have a lot of our own individual decisions that we can make here. And then it also shows, again, same problem with the gatekeeping model, that the linear model is that there's still a lack of control in transmitting messages and sometimes receiving messages. And it's complicated. You know, none of this is easy. This probably is a little bit more complicated because you got so many hands in the mix. You got so many people involved and so many messages that are out there. So when we look at culture, you can describe it in a couple of different ways, right? And so there is the view that culture is like a skyscraper, where you have high culture, which we discussed a minute ago. That's where you have art that's considered good taste, higher education, fine art, and then you have low culture, which is defined as questionable tastes of the masses. But in all likelihood, I'm going to be honest, if you make me pick one of these two, I'm probably going to rather go to a romantic comedy movie than to an art gallery, right? And so, but again, that's how you define these things, that it's really a hierarchy of understanding of the media and of art and of those processes. But then also you have the metaphor of culture as a map. And so rather than being vertically organized, it's kind of an ongoing process. It accommodates diverse tastes. Media can take us to places that we might recognize or that might be unfamiliar, and it flattens out that hierarchy. So we all experience a similar type of relationship with the media. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD or you have a middle school education, right? So we all experience those types of relationships with the media. Now, while the media change, we change too. And so there's always that question, what came first? Did we change? Did the media change? It's probably simultaneous. It would be my opinion. But you can see changes in media as media transform and grow and new types of inventions occur. You can watch changes in society as well, right? And so the Industrial Revolution to the mid 20th century, Industrial Revolution is when you had real advances in, for example, in media, the printing press. It became automated, and where you might print 100 newspapers a week, now you printed 100,000 in a day because of the machinery. And so it changed the access to newspapers for everybody, right? As you had this type of change in the media, this Industrial Revolution, then there were 4 values, and you've probably heard of these before. America began to focus on some values. First was, efficient work. And so because those advances allowed people to work efficiently, they allowed for those changes. They allowed for people to have better incomes, better opportunities, also celebrated the individual, right? And so we talked about how when books became more accessible, then individuality became more important. It was important to belong to the group, but now the individual, we could think for ourselves. We didn't have to wait for someone to tell us a story. We could read it ourselves and decide what we thought about it. A rational order for the way society should work, right? And so as these things developed, you had the opportunity, if you wanted to reject tradition, embrace progress, which brought into an era called the Progressive Era. And so when you had changes in the media, you also had changes in values. And so the values of the modern period, again, were efficient work, celebrate the individual, believing in a rational order, and rejecting tradition and embracing progress, while the postmodern period is the mid-20th century to today, right? So mid-20th century would be probably about the time your grandparents were born. So until today, right? And so the dominant values of the postmodern period are that celebrating populism. And what that means is that populism is an appeal to ordinary people who feel like their concerns are disregarded by an established elite group. And you can hear these conversations in some of the events that are occurring today. You can see that that it gives people who maybe 100 years ago would not have had a voice. Now that populism is celebrated and encouraged, right? And so people who might have felt like their concerns were disregarded are now have a voice, right? Also questioning authority. Do we have platforms, right, to do that? And again, because we live in a country that values the First Amendment and we can speak our minds, we can do these things, right? And so, and again, we're talking about it in that particular culture. And then an embracing of technology. So that's really important as we go forward. You can see that happening in society today. I can see that happening for myself, and I'm older than you. You can see that happening in your social group now. So I think that even your grandparents have changed with that time, probably would fall into these categories as well, right? And so the semester we want to develop media literacy. And so becoming media literate is a critical process, right? We want to be able to describe what's going on, right? To analyze it, to interpret, and to evaluate it, and then to engage with it, right? So in order to be media literate, you have to be able to go through those processes, right? You need to be able to describe what's happening, to think about it, and to be able to analyze it in light of culture and in light of what's going on today. Can you interpret it? Can you put it in a framework? Can you explain it to somebody else? And evaluating it also, you need something to evaluate by, so maybe compare to a process that existed in the past. And then engage, because you're always going to have some type of action as you develop media literacy. You're going to learn, and you're also going to be able to apply that to your life. So to be able to have this critical perspective, and I don't mean criticize, I just mean being able to look at something maybe from a neutral perspective is always the best way, because then you can fairly and objectively make some evaluations, right? And so this is what we want to do, because it's going to allow us to do some things. First of all, we have a voice. We can participate in the debate on media impact, and if your profession has anything to do with the media, even if you are going to law school, you are still, because you're here at the Manship School and you're going to learn the things you learn, you are setting yourself up in a good way to be able to have a seat at that table, to participate in a debate and a discussion on the impact of media. And its impact on democracy, very important. Its impact on our culture. We can think about the media personally. What do we consume? What do we receive? How does it affect us? How do these messages impact us, our family, our state, our country? And so I really think that we all are responsible for critiquing the media. We don't have to receive every message that comes our way. We can be discerning in what we hear and where it comes from. So we'll have some fun this semester talking about all of these things. If you have any questions, be sure to reach out to me. Thanks a bunch.